The highway home always looks the same in November. Gray sky, bare trees, the occasional Tim Hortons sign glowing orange through the fog. I had driven this stretch of the Trans-Canada more times than I could count, but that morning my hands felt different on the wheel. Looser. Like I had finally stopped gripping something I'd been holding for years. I turned the radio on and it landed, without searching. On the CBC station my mother used to play in the kitchen. I didn't change it. I just drove, and let the familiar voices fill the car, and tried not to think too hard about what I was driving toward. My father's retirement ceremony was that evening. 32 years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they were finally putting the Red Surge away for good. The community center in Carleton Place had been booked for months. My aunt had told me there would be over 200 people, colleagues, commissioners, people he had served alongside in postings from Yellowknife to Fredericton. It was a big deal. He had earned it. I was proud of him. That was never the question. The question was whether I could walk into a room where my stepmother would be standing, and keep my face still. Her name is Diane. My father married her when I was 14, and she had spent the 11 years since then deciding, quietly and consistently, that I was a disappointment. Not dramatically. Diane wasn't the kind of woman who made scenes. She did it with small words and the right company. She did it with a look across a table, or a pause before answering a question about me, a pause that said more than I'm willing to say out loud. She had a gift for it, really. The ability to diminish someone without leaving fingerprints. The thing she liked to say most, whenever my name came up in conversation, was that I had never been able to follow through, that I started things and left them, that I had potential, such a shame. But you couldn't tell her she hadn't tried to help me find direction. She said it with a kind of sad generosity, like she was covering for me, like she had chosen to protect my reputation by only telling a partial truth. The partial truth was this. I had left my position at the Department of Justice in Ottawa 18 months ago. I had been a federal Crown prosecutor. I had left voluntarily, mid-career, without a public explanation. And Diane, who knew nothing about why, had filled that silence with her own story. The one where I had burned out. The one where I couldn't handle the pressure. The one where I had, once again, proven that I was not quite able to sustain the things I started. She had been telling that story to my father's friends, to the neighbours, to the women in her book club, for a year and a half. I knew because my cousin Rachel had texted me in the spring. Just so you know, Diane's been telling people at the Legion that you had some kind of breakdown and had to leave your job. I thought you should hear it. I had read that text in a parking garage in downtown Toronto and sat with it for a long time before I put my phone away and went back to what I was doing. What I was doing, at that point, was preparing for a case that would take another 4 months and would eventually result in a conviction that made the front page of the Globe and Mail. But that's not something I had told anyone in Carleton Place. That's not something I had told my father, because my father trusted Diane, and because I had learned a long time ago that explaining myself to people who had already decided what they thought was a waste of energy that could go somewhere useful. I had learned that from him, actually. Though I'm not sure he knew he had taught me. I pulled off the highway at the edge of town and stopped at the Tim Hortons on Mill Street to get coffee. I sat in the parking lot and drank it slowly and watched a woman in a yellow coat walk her dog along the frost-hardened sidewalk, and I thought about the fact that I had not been home in 14 months. Not because I hated it here. I didn't. I had grown up in this town. I knew the names of the streets and the families who had lived on them and which arena made the best hot chocolate during Saturday morning hockey. I had good memories in this town. I just also had Diane in this town, and the story she had been building about me, and the face my father sometimes made when he looked at me like he was waiting for me to confirm something he hoped wasn't true. I finished the coffee, started the car, and drove to my father's house. Diane was in the kitchen when I arrived, arranging something on a tray. She was dressed already, which surprised me. It was only 4 in the afternoon and the ceremony didn't start until 7. She was wearing a deep green dress and her hair was set, and she looked up when I came through the door with the particular expression she reserved for me, warm enough to be polite, careful enough to communicate that she was being patient. "You made it," she said. I said I would. "Of course." She smiled and turned back to the tray. "Your father's upstairs getting ready. He'll be happy you're here." I set my bag down and went to find him. My father was standing in front of the mirror in his bedroom, doing up the buttons on his dress uniform. He turned when I knocked on the open door, and his face did something it didn't always do when he saw me. It opened. Just for a moment. He looked relieved, And then he looked proud, and then he looked like he wasn't sure which feeling was appropriate, so he covered both of them by pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Good drive?" he asked when he let go. "Fine. Clear roads." "You look tired." "I'm okay, Dad." He studied my face the way he had always studied it, like he was looking for something he couldn't name. Then he nodded and turned back to the mirror. "Big night," he said. "I know. I'm proud of you." He smiled at his reflection. "Let's see how the speech goes first." We drove to the community center together, the three of us, Diane in the front seat and me in the back. She talked the whole way about who had RSVP'd, about the flowers she had ordered, about the deputy commissioner who was apparently flying in from Ottawa. I looked out the window and watched the town slide past, and thought about how strange it was to be in the back seat again, the way I had been as a teenager, feeling 14 years old and 32 at the same time. The community center parking lot was already full when we arrived. I could see people through the lit windows, dark shapes moving against the warm interior light. My father got out of the car and was immediately met by two men in uniform who shook his hand and clapped him on the shoulder, and he was absorbed into the crowd before we even reached the door. Diane and I walked in together. The hall was decorated with force colors and framed photographs of postings and a banner that read 32 years of service in bold letters above the stage. Tables had been set with candles and white linens, and there was a bar along the far wall where a line of people was already gathering. The noise was warm and layered laughter, and the particular comfortable sound of people who know each other well. I found my name tag at the registration table and put it on. Diane found hers and stood beside me for a moment, surveying the room, and I watched her spot people she recognized and calculate where she wanted to go. "Do you know anyone here?" she asked me, and the way she asked it gently, with just the faintest note of concern, was the first move of the evening. "A few people," I said. "Of course. Well, stick with me if you need to. I know most of the senior people by now." I smiled. "I'll be fine." I moved away before she could respond and went to find something to drink. I spent the first part of the evening near the edge of the room, talking with a few of my father's older colleagues who remembered me from when I was young and asked what I was doing now. I said I was working in law, which was true, and left it there. I didn't volunteer more than was asked. I was good at that. It was around 8 o'clock, after the first round of speeches and before the formal dinner, that the evening turned. I was standing with Rachel, my cousin, the one who had sent me the text, near the side of the stage when Diane came over with two women I didn't recognize. They were both around her age, well-dressed, the kind of women who came to these events regularly and knew the right names. "There she is," Diane said, in the voice she used when she was performing warmth. "This is my stepdaughter, Megan. Helen, Carol, you've heard me mention her." The two women smiled. One of them, Helen, I thought, said, "Oh yes, we've heard so much about you." Something in the way she said it told me exactly what she had heard. "It's so nice that you could come up for this," Diane continued. She turned to her friends with a small, confiding expression. "We weren't sure she'd make it. She's been going through a bit of a transition lately. But family shows up, right?" Rachel went very still beside me. "A transition," I said. "Well," Diane lifted a shoulder. "You know, after everything with Ottawa, it takes time to figure out what's next." The two women nodded with the careful sympathy of people who had been given a version of this story before, and were now watching it be confirmed in real time. "It was a lot for her," Diane said. "The pressure, the pace. Not every path is for everyone, and there's no shame in that. Megan knows I've always supported her in finding something that fits." She said it so reasonably, so kindly, like she was doing me a favor by contextualizing my failure in the most generous possible terms, and I should be grateful she wasn't saying worse. Rachel's hand found my arm. I looked at Diane and I thought about all the things I could say. I thought about them carefully and completely, the way I had been trained to do, turning each one over and looking at its shape and its consequence, and what it would cost. And then I said, "Thanks, Diane." That was all. I turned back to Rachel and we continued the conversation we had been having before the interruption, and after a moment Diane and her friends drifted away toward another part of the room. Rachel looked at me. "How are you not saying anything?" "What would I say?" "I don't know." "The truth?" "She wouldn't hear it," I said. "And everyone here is my father's colleague. Tonight is for him." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're unbelievably calm." "I'm not, actually," I said. "I'm just quiet." "There's a difference. I had learned it over years of sitting across tables from people who had done terrible things and listening to their version of events without letting my face change. The calm was a tool. Inside the tool there was something else, something older and more tired, something that had been waiting for a long time for my father to look at me, the way he had looked at me upstairs in his bedroom, without the hesitation in it. The dinner was served. The speeches continued. My father stood at the podium and talked about service and community and the people who had shaped him, and he mentioned Diane, and he mentioned a few colleagues by name. And he didn't mention me, and I clapped with everyone else and watched his face from across the room. It was near the end of the evening, when people were beginning to move around again and collect coats, that it happened. I was standing alone for a moment near the back wall, beside the display table of photographs and commendations my father's colleagues had assembled. There were pictures spanning 3 decades, my father, young and straight-shouldered at his first posting, my father in Yellowknife with frost on his jacket, my father shaking hands with various officials at various ceremonies. I was looking at one of the older photographs, one I didn't recognize, when I heard someone approach. I looked up. The woman who had stopped in front of me was somewhere in her mid-50s. In a dark suit with the insignia of a senior Crown official, I recognized the designation before I fully processed her face. She was looking at me with the focused, evaluating expression of someone who has spent a career reading rooms. "I thought that was you," she said. Her name was Margaret Okafor. She was the Assistant Deputy Attorney General for the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General's Criminal Law Division. I had worked under her supervision for 8 months during a secondment program 4 years ago. She was one of the most precise and uncompromising lawyers I had ever encountered, and I had spent those 8 months trying to be worthy of working in the same office. I hadn't known she would be here. I hadn't known she knew my father. "Margaret," I said. "I didn't realize. Your father and my husband served in the same detachment in the 90s, she said. "We've been friends for years." She looked at me with that same focused clarity. "I heard you left the federal service." "I did. I also heard," she said, more quietly, about the Tremblay conviction. She said it the way people say the name of something large. The Tremblay case had taken 2 years of my life. It was a financial fraud prosecution involving a former provincial cabinet minister. The kind of case that accumulates enemies and delays and procedural challenges in roughly equal measure. I had left the Department of Justice to take it on as special independent counsel, an arrangement that required me to formally sever my federal appointment and operate under a separate mandate. It was the kind of work that didn't come with a press release at the beginning, only at the end. The conviction had come 4 months ago. The Globe and Mail had covered it. The CBC had covered it. In Carleton Place, apparently, it had not filtered through the channels that reached Diane's book club. "That was your file," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. It was. She was quiet for a moment, looking at me. Then she said, "I want to talk to you about what's next. I've been building a new prosecution team and I've been thinking about your name for 3 months. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced a card. "Not tonight. But call me." I took the card. And that was the moment Diane appeared. She had come from the direction of the bar with her friend Helen, and she stopped when she saw me talking to the woman in the suit, and I could see her recalibrating, trying to place Margaret, trying to assess the weight of the conversation she had walked into. Margaret looked at Diane, then back at me. "Is this my stepmother?" I said. "Diane." Diane stepped forward with her social smile and extended her hand. "Hello. I'm sorry to interrupt." I didn't realize Megan was talking with anyone important. The word important landed the way she intended it to, as a compliment to Margaret, and a subtle erasure of me, the implication being that Megan did not usually talk to important people and was lucky to be doing so now. Margaret shook Diane's hand without changing her expression. "Diane," she said. "I'm Margaret Okafor. I'm the Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Criminal Law." A small silence. "I was just telling your stepdaughter," Margaret continued, in the same even tone, "that I've been trying to reach her for months. She's one of the most capable prosecutors I've encountered in 25 years of this work. The Tremblay conviction was the most significant, successful prosecution this province has seen in a decade, and it was hers." She paused. "I'm hoping to convince her to come and help us build something." The room hadn't changed. The noise level was the same, the lights were the same, but something shifted in the air immediately around us, the way air shifts in a room when a window opens. Helen said nothing. She was looking at her shoes. Diane's face had done something complicated. The warmth was still there, but it had lost its footing. She was smiling, but the smile was working harder than usual, recalculating in real time, trying to find the ground under a story that had just lost several of its load-bearing walls. "I didn't realize," she said. "No," said Margaret pleasantly. "These things aren't always well publicized, which is by design." She looked at me. "Call me, Megan. We have a lot to discuss." She excused herself and moved away through the crowd. I stood with Diane and Helen for a moment in the particular quiet that follows something that cannot be taken back. Rachel materialized from somewhere behind me. I felt her arrive before I saw her. Diane said, after a long moment. "Well, I had no idea you were involved in something like that." "I know," I said. You never said anything." "No." She looked at me and I looked back at her, and I thought about the 14 months of silence, the story she had told. The way she had described me to those two women earlier in the evening. She's been going through a transition. Not every path is for everyone, and I thought about all the versions of this moment I could choose. The one where I said something pointed. The one where I documented the look on her face. The one where I walked away without speaking. What I actually said was, "I'm going to find my dad." I left her there. My father was near the stage, surrounded by a last cluster of colleagues making their goodbyes. When I reached him, he turned and put an arm around my shoulder, the way he had done when I was small, and I stood beside him while a retired superintendent told a long story about a posting in Northern Ontario, and I listened to the story, and I felt my father's arm warm and solid and present. When the superintendent drifted away, my father looked at me sideways. "Margaret Okafor said hello," he said. "I know." I talked to her. He was quiet. He was waiting, I realized, for me to tell him what I knew he hadn't known. About the case. About what I had been doing for the last 18 months. About the thing that should have come from me instead of from a woman at a party. I should have told him sooner. That part was on me, and I knew it. "Dad," I said, "there are some things I should have explained a long time ago." He nodded slowly. "I think I'm ready to hear them." We found 2 chairs against the wall and we sat down, and the party moved around us. And I told him the truth. All of it. The secondment structure, the mandate, the 2 years of work on a case I couldn't discuss publicly until the verdict came in. Why I had gone quiet. Why I hadn't corrected the story. He listened the way he had always listened to things that mattered completely still. Eyes forward, only occasionally glancing at me to mark something important. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I should have asked you directly," he said finally. "I should have told you without waiting to be asked." He nodded again. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at me, and the hesitation I had seen in his eyes earlier in the evening, that waiting, that withheld thing, was gone. "I'm sorry," he said. "I let someone else's version stand." I felt something in my chest release that I hadn't fully known was held. "It's okay," I said. "No," he said. "It isn't, but we can do better." Outside, the parking lot was cold and bright with the early November frost, and the last guests were pulling on their coats and moving toward their cars, and the community center windows threw long gold rectangles of light across the pavement. I stood there for a moment after my father went inside to say his last goodbyes, and I breathed the cold air and felt the particular quiet of a town at night. A town I had grown up in, a town that had heard a story about me that wasn't true. I thought about Margaret's card in my jacket pocket. I thought about what it might mean to come back, not to Carleton Place specifically, but to the work, to a room where people knew my name and what it meant. My cousin Rachel came to stand beside me. She had her coat half on, one arm still searching for the sleeve. "That was something," she said. "Yeah." The look on Diane's face. I saw it. Rachel found her sleeve. She pulled the coat on and looked out at the parking lot and then at me. "Are you going to take the job?" "I don't know yet." "You should." "Maybe." She bumped her shoulder against mine. "For what it's worth, I've known for years that you were going to be fine. I just didn't always know how to say it without sounding like I was arguing with someone." I laughed. It came out surprised, which was the best kind. We stood there for another few minutes, not saying much, while the last of the guests filtered out and the lights in the community center began to dim from the inside. The night was very clear. You could see more stars than you ever could in Toronto, out here where the light didn't drown them. My father came out eventually, coat on, and stood beside me, and the 3 of us walked to the car. He didn't say anything about Diane on the drive home. She sat in the front seat and looked out the window, and I sat in the back the same as always, but the air was different, and everyone in the car could feel it. When we got home, my father walked me to the door of the guest room, the way he had when I was young, and he stopped before he said goodnight, and looked at me with the same expression he had worn in front of his bedroom mirror open, something like relief, something like recognition. "You came home," he said. "You're my dad," I said. He nodded. He put a hand on my shoulder for a moment, briefly, the weight of it solid and present. Then he said goodnight and went down the hall. I stood in the doorway of the guest room and listened to the house settle around me. The old, familiar creaks, the furnace, the particular silence of a house in a small town in November, and I thought about the drive up that morning, the radio finding its station, the feeling of releasing a grip I hadn't known I was holding. I took out Margaret's card and looked at it. Then I put it on the nightstand and turned off the light. There would be time for next steps in the morning. Tonight was finished, and it had ended the way the true things eventually do, not with a speech, not with a confrontation, but with two people sitting against a wall at a party, finally deciding to tell each other the truth. That was enough. That was more than enough. I knew who I was. I had always known. Now he knew too.